Let's see. I'll give you 2 more minutes before we start. Okay. Our presentation started. Today we will discuss risk analysis from the perspective of corporate financial analysis, and we'll basically cover the impact of leverage on risk, and this is something that is going to be the main focus of today's lecture. And something if you know about Modigliani and Miller capital structure theories. So there's a bit of that in this. We're not going to get into great depth in there, but the intuition behind what we're doing today relates to basically Modigliani and Miller's proposition number 2. We will discuss the types of risk investors face when investing in firms, looking at how to identify those risks in financial statements, look at some risk analysis tools, and finally try to identify earnings manipulation. So yeah, that's the program for today, with a strong focus on risk and financial leverage. So okay, doesn't seem to be working, my pointer. All right. So this is what we're covering. We touched on that on the first slide, so I'm going to skip slide number 2. So the main idea when we look at risk from an investor's perspective is we know investors are willing to take on risks, but as a compensation for the risk taken, they will expect a return. So when we're looking at the risk-return relationship, what we expect to see is a positive relationship. So the higher the risk, the higher the expected return for those assets. One of the interesting things in the last mid-half of the last century finance was to identify that not all risks were or are relevant to investors. Maybe some of those risks are relevant, and we will discuss that a little bit later today. So main takeaway from this is risk and return. There's an obvious relationship there where you will only be happy to assume more risk if you get higher return or expected return. Does anyone have a counterexample to this where people may take risk when the expected payoff is not as good as you expected to be? Or do you play in the casino? Do you play a little bit of games and things? Are the odds for or against people playing different games? Is the payoff exactly the same as the expected return? Is it lower or is it higher? Lower, right? But people still play. Why is that? Is that irrational or any ideas? Yeah, but when you look at the expected return, it's lower than expected. So why would people still gamble? Well, there's a perceived benefit in some way, right? So you are getting value out of gambling in itself. It's not necessarily a rational bet that they're doing, but they're not all of the benefits are coming from expected returns. The benefits coming from the action of gambling and what you feel when you do that. For people who enjoy doing it. So what's the risk of common equity? What we are saying here is we are relating risk, return, and we are associating risk to leverage, financial leverage. And what we're saying is as leverage increases, as a firm has more and more debt, the shareholders will have increased benefits as long as the return on asset is higher than the cost of debt. So if the firm is profitable, taking on more debt is a good thing for investors. What is the additional incentive for firms to take on leverage? Why is leverage at times a better source of financing than equity? So the two main benefits are the cost of debt is lower than the cost of equity, and the other one is interest payments from debt can be deducted from income taxes. So those are the two main benefits that take companies to taking on more debt. So where's the link between leverage and risk? The relationship between leverage and risk is that the higher the level of debt, the higher the probability of default. At least in theory. So when you go from state zero where you have no debt to a new state where you have some debt, the probability of default is higher, just because you have debt. So if something happens and you have debt and you don't have enough funds to repay it, you have a slightly higher chance of defaulting. And the more debt you have, the higher that probability. Although capital structure models suggest that only a very high leverage level will have a significant impact on the terms of default, the truth is having debt gets the firm in a position where they may default. So the main question then is, in the continuum between no debt at all and 100% debt, where should a firm sit? Right, so that's the big question to answer. And as we will see a little bit later today, that depends on who you ask the question to. It also depends to what firm we are talking about, in what industry they're performing, and how well they're doing. So let's go through some types of risk. So we have we listed there 4 types of risks. International, driven by what's happening internationally, then domestic risks. Those two have are very closely related, more and more, because you have business cycle is something you could attribute to international factors as well as inflation and demographic and political changes. So what we mean by international and domestic risks is we're looking at risks that are larger than the firm and that are outside the control of the management of the firm. So that's what's similar to those 2 types of risks. The third category is industry risk, which has to do with technologies used in the industry. One of the things we discussed in recent weeks is the impairment of assets when there's a tech change, and that is definitely something that has an impact in terms of risk. When you are a company in an industry that is swapping technologies, you are taking the risk of keeping the obsolete technology and having to change or become a late adopter. Competition, definitely the level of competition of the industry has an impact on the level of risk. We discussed this when we looked at Porter's 5 forces. So we looked at the higher the competition, lower the margins, the higher the risk, the higher it is to enter in the industry, but at the same time, the higher it is to stay alive in that industry. Industries with fewer players, they will tend to have higher margins, be more profitable, and less risky. The level of competition in the industry definitely has an impact on the risk. How do we source the materials, the labor, level of unionization definitely plays a role, especially in one of the lines in your income statement. If you have a more unionized workforce, they will have more bargaining power and potentially have more pressure over salaries. So those industry-specific risks are risks in which the company has some level of management. So they can sort of influence some of those risks. Not all of them, not entirely, but they can have an impact on those risks. And finally, firm-specific risk, which is what happens from the door to the inside of the firm. And that is entirely under the control of the firm's management. So what sort of strategy, direction they're planning, how do they see the company evolving in the environment they're in, and then things more, even more specific, like any pending lawsuits the company has, any exposure to potential lawsuits in the future. So all of those things are risks investors have to bear. As I mentioned before, what we will see shortly is that in this, because the next question is, okay, we understand there's a relationship between risk and return. The question is, which risk? Is it all of those risks? Is it some of them? Is it a portion of some of those risks? And for those of you who did many other finance courses, you probably have the answer to that question already, but we'll get to that shortly. So how do we assess the level of risk in a company? How do we look at the liquidity risk in the short term versus the long term? And we did a little bit of this when we looked at credit ratings last week. So we will quickly go through how we look at risk and liquidity risk in a firm. A few definitions. We're looking at short-term liquidity risk when we look at the ability the firm has to basically meet their obligations in the short term. That is what we will look at when we look at working capital management. Long-term solvency risk has more to do with profitability and to whether the company has the ability to repay its debt. Credit risk we are defining as making the payments when they're due. And the credit risk itself is the opposite of that, is not making payments when they're due. And that could be because of a serious financial situation, but sometimes it could be only a short-term lack of resources availability for the firm. Bankruptcy risk is the likelihood of filing for bankruptcy and liquidation, or I should say enter into administration here in Australia. And then market equity risk, or beta risk. So beta is the way we measure the risk that really matters. And we call that risk systematic as opposed to unsystematic risk. Right? And if we go back 2 slides and we discuss which of those risks are systematic and unsystematic, which one would you single out as an unsystematic risk out of those 4? Is there any of those that you would go, oh, that's not systematic, that is completely unsystematic? Anyone? The first specific risk is unsystematic. Right? And I should have probably given a better definition of systematic than unsystematic. Right? But the definition of unsystematic is specifically firm specific. And the reason why we call that risk unsystematic is because it doesn't have to do with things that can be diversified away. So put in other words, that firm-specific risk is the type of risk that it's only specific to that firm, and that if investors buy shares of that firm, put them in a portfolio, there's a large chance of that risk that is going to be diversified away. Right? Because it's only specific to the firm, and it's only going to affect these firms specifically and not other firms in the portfolio. So with that in mind, when we're looking at the risk-return relationship, we know that this firm-specific risk can be diversified away. So what does beta measure? Beta measures what we call systematic risk. And that is the risk that is still present after we put the shares of this firm in a portfolio that is completely diversified. So once we eliminate all the specific firm risk, beta measures the risk we are still having to get paid for as investors. And what we do to measure that beta is look at the volatility of the price of the share, individual share, compared to the volatility of a diversified portfolio, an index, a market index. You can go as back as, if you're using weekly data, 52 weeks, and look at how those two behave together, and the slope of the linear relationship between those two returns will give you the beta of the stock. Don't worry, you won't have to measure that in the final exam here, so I'm not getting into those details right now. The interesting thing to mention here is that beta, the way it's calculated, may not capture the risk of financial stress. Because what that is looking is at the volatility of the stock return in the past 72 weeks. But the volatility of financial stress is coming from moving forward, considering risk that may happen to the firm, whether the firm has enough funds to repay debt. And when you look at the past, say, 52 weeks again, capital structure may have changed dramatically in that period of time. In the last year, the capital structure of the firm may have changed dramatically. So those 52 observations we took are not necessarily the best predictors of future probability of distress. And one final definition here is the financial reporting manipulation or earnings management that we mentioned a few times, and we will get back to that a little bit later today as well. So let's first get into short-term liquidity risk. This is definitely looking at whether the company has the short-term liquidity to pay the bills, right? And we associate this with working capital. So these short-term liquidity risks increase when the firms, many times when the firms are growing, and when firms are not able to match short-term receipts and payments. So when the cash conversion cycle means that the company has to pay back the suppliers before they get money from their customers. That is the main source of risk there. And that risk will be increased the larger the gap between payables and receivables. It will increase the lower the profit margin of the firm, because the lower the profit margin, the less money the company has available each turn of the cycle to repay. And it also increases with growth. So the higher the growth, the more funds you will need to finance that gap. So those three things you have to manage to limit the short-term liquidity risk. What are the typical ratios to assess the short-term liquidity risk? We've seen this a fair bit. I'm not a big fan about calling minimums and maximums of ratios. There's some clear minimums. For instance, your current ratio, you would want it to be at least one. You want to be able to show that the company, if they convert into cash everything that they have at the moment, they have enough funds to repay suppliers. Quick ratio, you know that what we do is we take out inventory from the current ratio. That minimum of 0.5, I'm not that inflexible about that. So definitely what I would focus out of slide number 9 is definitely the top one, current ratio, and then the working capital activity ratio. That working capital activity ratio at the bottom, that is what I mentioned previously in a slightly different way when I was talking about the cash conversion cycle. Remember that when we look at working capital, we can look at each of the components as either a turnover or a number of days. And the easiest way to look at it is number of days. And if you know that from the time you buy something from your suppliers to the time you have to pay them, you have 60 days. And then if you have 15 days in inventory and 90 days that you're giving your buyers, you know that on average it's taking you 105 days to get your money back from whatever you're selling, compared to 60 days that you have to go back to your suppliers and get it back. So those 45 days difference is the number of days you will have to finance in your working capital cycle. As I was saying before, the larger the gap, the higher the risk. The lower the profitability in each transaction, the higher that risk. The higher the growth will also entail a higher risk. That doesn't mean don't grow. That means if you're growing more, you have to make sure that you have enough financing to bridge that gap. So we're looking at long-term solvency risk, and we discussed this many times during separation analysis. We definitely look at leverage. We look at coverage ratios. And more than anything, we look at the overall profitability of the firm. How profitable is this firm? Will this firm be able in the long run to repay interest, principal, of the debt or not? As I said, as we said at the very beginning, leverage is that mechanism by which profitability overall increases when the company is taking debt at a rate that is lower than when the company is more profitable than the cost of debt. Leverage is a good thing. When the relationship is the other way around, taking on more debt is not a good idea. These 7 C's of credit risk are very closely associated with the 5 C's to credit analysis that we mentioned last week. So we're basically looking at what are the circumstances, why is it that the company is taking on more debt? That definitely identifies whether this additional debt is going to have a big impact in additional risk or not. If a company is taking on more debt because they need to finance working capital and it is a profitable firm, that's not a big deal. if the company is taking on a new loan, so we pay an existing loan that they haven't been able to pay back to genuine profitability, that's the other issue. Taking on new debt or more debt, so we pay existing debts. What are the cash flows looking like? Is this a healthy, growing company? Is this a company that just needs to bridge a gap between paying to suppliers and getting paid back? Is this a company that is bridging the gap between making a huge investment and getting a return from that investment? Those two are reasonable reasons to take on debt and not necessarily having big increases in rates. However, if the company is financing a day-to-day operation that is not profitable, or if the company is in a very competitive environment where you see profit margins going down, more players coming in the industry, and you see the pressure being up, you know that that's going to have an impact on future profitability and the likelihood of return paying back. So looking at cash flows and forecasted cash flows is definitely something you need to do to assess the level of credit risk a firm faces. What sort of collateral does the company have? Is all of the debt issued collateralized? Is there a backing for each and every one of those securities? That lowers the risk, right? Because in the end, and I'm bringing you back to our last lecture, in the end, institutions lending money to firms, what they want is to get paid back. Ideally, they're going to get paid back via profitable companies, but if they are not that certain that the company is going to be profitable enough to pay back, they will request some sort of collateral. And that is what's going to keep risks low. So what is the capacity for debt? If you have a company with a coverage ratio, say EBIT to interest expenses, that is 1.05, the capacity for new debt for that company is very low. Because most of their operating profits are already going to pay debt. Whereas if the company has a multiple of, or a coverage ratio, EBIT on interest of 20 times, you go like, no problem. These guys can take on more debt because they're already generating enough operating profit to pay 20 times the current interest payments. So they can easily take on a little bit more debt without increasing risks all that much. What sort of contingencies there are? Are there any unsettled lawsuits? Firms or employees? These are all things that you look from a credit perspective, because most of those things, if not all of them, will have priority over their contracts. So if the company has to settle a lawsuit, that is money that is going to, even though your EBIT is 20 times interests, if the company has a huge lawsuit and they may need to settle for that and pay a lump sum of money to settle, that has an impact on risk for shareholders. We discussed character of management. What are management's abilities and also values? How did they behave in the past? Were they truthful in showing when the company was not doing well? Did they have a way out of those situations or not? And finally, what are the conditions in the existing debt contracts? Are there any clauses limiting what the company can do? We've gone through these covenants in more detail last week, but are there any reasons that for which the company will not be able to repay our debts? Is there different seniority in the debt structure that will make the company have to go and pay all these other lenders before they pay us? Where you sit in the seniority structure definitely has an impact on risk, right? If you're the first one to be paid, you have obviously less risk than someone who's at the end of that line. Let's have a quick look. We're going to be going very quickly through these three topics, mainly because we touched on that previously. Financial distress, analyzing the risk of bankruptcy, and finally, prediction models. The financial distress is not a 0-1 situation, it's more a continuum. And you can go all the way from failing to make up an interest payment to defaulting on principal. Two big different things. One thing is, oh, I didn't have money to pay this part of the interest. We may need to roll over the debt because we had some matching issues, but we are still repaying principal. And our worst case is not only we don't have money to repay interest, but we're finding it hard to get money to repay the portion of principal. Another level would be filing for bankruptcy or administration, in which case the company's management is going to step aside and there's going to be a third party becoming involved in the day-to-day management of the business and making sure creditors are paid. And the final stage in that continuum would be the liquidation of the firm. So the firm got to a stage in which it was more valuable ceasing to exist than existing. So what happens there? You're going to dispose of all the assets, repay everyone who can be repaid according to a pecking order in the seniority structure, and then those who are there's not enough funds for, well, very sorry for them. Bankruptcy risk comes into play when the company starts in that continuum and they're not able to pay interest payments. They cannot pay or meet their interest payments. And the main reason for doing this is allowing the company to reorganize and try and get back into good shape. If the company, as I said before, doesn't have the ability to turn this around and get back into business, you may have an administrator and a liquidator that will make the company cease to exist. As we've seen when we discussed credit, there's lots of measures lenders can take way before this happens, right? And that's the reason why you have permanency in contracts and you have monitoring of the activities of the firm. So that when you see things going not so well, you can have those hard conversations and take precautionary measures so that it does not end in a bankruptcy. May try to find prediction models based on a ratio. So the question was, is there a ratio that will predict likelihood of bankruptcy relevant habits? And tried with a list of them, and that is a long time ago, but looking at 9 ratios and looking at which of those will perform reasonably well. Out of those 29 ratios, there's 6 that stood out as ratios that could have some predictive ability over the chances of a company going bankrupt. And that is, they all involve, so the first one is net income over total liabilities, net income, so profit, bottom line of the income statement divided by total liabilities, bottom line of the income statement divided by total assets, which would be a return on assets. Total debt to total assets, so that is leverage ratio. Net working capital to total assets, so how intensive is the investment required in the firm in the short term compared to the overall investment. Current assets to current liabilities, which is our current ratio. And looking at current assets to operating expenses. So an improvement over Beaver's work was what we saw last week with Altman's set score, which is instead of a univariate analysis of bankruptcy, it's looking at multivariate prediction model. So instead of just looking at one possible explanation, is looking at a set of measures of how well the firm is doing as a better predictor of the chances of bankruptcy. So Altman's model produces a score, and then you have logic analysis that provides exactly a probability of bankruptcy. So Altman's score is gives you basically 3 ranges. If you go over 3, if you go below 1.8, and if you're in between. When you look at logic analysis like the one by Olson, you get a probability of bankruptcy as an outcome. If you look at all the models trying to predict bankruptcy, you will see that they look at how intensive in investment the company is, what are the financing factors, what is the financing structure of the firm. They will look at operating factors such as profitability, and finally they will also look at size and growth as potential explanatory variables of bankruptcy prediction. All of these things we've seen since week 3 when we did ratio analysis, and as I've been saying quite repeatedly during the subject, you can have as many ratios as you want. When you're doing your own analysis, you just need to make sure you have those 7 to 10 ratios that you're comfortable, that you're looking at all important matters within the firm. And it doesn't really matter if you use a coverage ratio using EBIT or EBITDA, because you can always correct for those things, and if you're doing it consistently over time, it's not going to have a huge impact. So there's not that much point in having 5 slightly different coverage ratios. Just pick your coverage ratio, use it consistently, and then choose ratios for each of those other categories. One final thing for today's short lecture is probably the main thing I want to discuss here, and that's the first point in this slide 19, which is the market equity beta risk, which we discussed a little bit earlier today. But I think the main takeaway of from slide 20 is what's included in that data. What's in there when we measure data? What sort of risks are we measuring in there? And when we look at the total risk of a firm, there's basically three components. And financial leverage is only one of them, right? There's two others that come first. So just think as risk as something that accumulates and sits on top of other risks. And just for a moment, just think about an income statement, right? And go from the top down. And if you go from the top down in an income statement, the first risk you see listed there is risk number 3, which is variability of sales. Right? And this has to do with how much do sales vary over time. And that is a source of risk for a company, right? Because if you have a company that, regardless of time of the year, stage of the life cycle, stage of the economic cycle, and so on and so forth, has a pretty steady stream of sales, that company is going to be less risky than a company that is heavily influenced by the economic cycle. And we know we have some defensive stocks and some more pro-cyclical stocks. And the main reason for that is some of the revenue in those companies tend to follow more the economic cycle or less. Does anyone have an example of companies that do not have a lot of variability in sales regardless of stage in the economic cycle? Okay, what would that be? Okay, yeah. So you would think that the variability of those sales is pretty, yeah, it's quite stable because it depends on, it's a first necessity kind of thing. And it can also be somehow, the consumption of those type of medications can be somehow insured, so having a third-party insurer or having coverage from the state. So there's a level of stability there, definitely. So the most typical example that you're given for this kind of very stable industries are utilities, right? People don't stop spending, like opening the tap at home if you're not, if you've got I'll put it the other way. If you get a pay rise, you don't go home and just leave the tap open. You're not going to spend more on those things if you're doing better. You're not going to spend less if you're doing worse. So those kind of businesses tend to have very reliable, steady income streams or revenue streams. On the other spectrum, you will have more luxury goods that are definitely more heavily dependent on how well you're doing. And demand for those products will depend on the overall condition of the economy. If people are doing better, are getting paid better, they will have more discretionary income, and they will be able to use it in the market. So those types of items and firms will have a higher variability of sales. So the next level in the risk pyramid is the degree of operational leverage. And this is, in many cases, in response to the previous one. So the degree of operating leverage is what portion of your total costs are fixed costs, right? And a higher proportion of fixed costs mean more risk. Because what that means is, regardless of how well you're doing with your revenue at this point in time, you would still have to pay whatever amount of fixed cost you have. And as opposed to that, firms with a more variable cost structure, those companies tend to be less risky, right? Because they would go, okay, if I don't have the revenue, I don't have to pay the cost. Because the only reason why I pay this cost is because I have this revenue. So degree of operational leverage is definitely something that has an impact on risk. You would expect companies with very stable and predictable streams of revenue to be able to take on more or higher operational leverage. Because if you know with certainty how much you're going to be making, you can commit to a higher portion of fixed costs and get some sort of discounts for those costs. Because usually paying variable is more expensive than paying fixed. And the reason why we're putting these three risks together is because some of the operational leverage and financial leverage decisions are dependent on how risky is the company at the sales variability level. Right? As I just said, companies with high variability will have less operating leverage, and companies more stable will have higher operating leverage. If we move to the next level of risk, which is financial leverage, where does the financial leverage come from? The financial leverage risk component comes from not the fixed operating costs, but by the fixed interest or financial costs. So I initially said, imagine an income statement. Number 3, which is variability of sales, is the very top of your income statement. When you're looking at the degree of operational leverage, you're looking at how much EBIT fluctuates or varies, because that EBIT is your revenue minus all your expenses, fixed and variable. And when you're looking at degree of financial leverage, you're going down one step in the income statement and you're going to the before taxes, profit before taxes. Right? So that is a profit before taxes, but it's after paying interest. The fixed component that is associated with risk in financial leverage is interest payments. So companies with very stable revenue and high enough and profitable to repay a high degree of operational leverage, high fixed costs, may also take on debt, increasing their financial leverage, because they have a high enough coverage ratio so that they can repay those interest payments. So those are the firms that are benefiting from taking on leverage, because once they account for the variability of sales, they pay their operating expenses, they have an EBIT that is many times the commitments they have on fixed payments on interest. So those are the firms that can really take on higher financial leverage and make them more profitable. Whereas if you have companies that have very uncertain revenue streams, they cannot get a good operating structure, so they're less profitable and they cannot take on high levels of debt because it's not profitable for them. So those three components, the three components you see in data, when you measure data. And you know how a few weeks ago we calculated unlevered and levered data, the complete and without leverage. So when you're thinking about an unlevered beta, that is a beta that contains points 3 and 1 in it. So your unlevered beta is that beta that comes from the operational side of the business itself, right? And when you think about levered beta, that beta is one that has those two components, variability of sales and operating leverage, and also includes the degree of financial leverage. So when you're looking at a levered beta, you're seeing all those three explanatory variables taken into account. Any questions so far? A short mention on earnings manipulation. So this is something you saw while I was up here, but when we're thinking about earnings manipulation from a financial analyst perspective, what we're trying to find is how is it that we can observe something that is not that easy to find? How do we find something that is not easily observable? And you can always think about incentives, right? Before digging deeper into financial statements, before making a very comprehensive analysis, you can think, well, what are the incentives management in this company may have to manipulate earnings? Are there very high things at stake here that may push them to manipulate earnings? And here we list a few reasons to manipulate earnings, which is obtaining debt at a lower cost. So why would trying to obtain debt at a lower cost be a reason for manipulating earnings? Well, because if you show that you're more profitable, that will make your potential lenders think, oh, they can easily repay. This is going to charge them much higher interest rates because they're less risky than what the company actually is. So earnings manipulation could be driven by a need to lower interest rates. The other one is to try and influence stock prices. So if you see that management of the company has a large portion of their salary being paid in stock options, you will say, this guy really doesn't want to try and manipulate stock prices because they're getting a big bonus. So that is something that will make you look at things that could be driving earnings higher than they actually are. I just mentioned the bonuses that could be in the form of stock options, or it could be in any other way. And the last one would be to try and avoid violation of debt covenants. We mentioned long list of debt covenants, but one of them could be a minimum coverage ratio. If your EBIT to interest is under 3.5 times, we will readjust the contract and make the debt more onerous to the company. So if you see that the company is very close to that level, and all of a sudden you see a spike in earnings, that's a good indication that you may need to spend a little bit more time trying to understand what happened with that change in profitability for the firm. We discussed diversification of firm-specific risk. So I think we're clear that there's a portion of the risk that is not relevant to shareholders. They won't be expected to be paid for that. and we have to be aware of that. Life cycle, what about the risk of a product or industry moving into a decline stage? We also discussed that, and we know that the impact that could have in a firm's ability to get on new debt is quite large. Just want to mention to value at risk here. Value at risk is not something that you would look in the context of corporate financial analysis. Have you dealt with value at risk? Someone else? Have you seen it before? No? All right. Yeah, value at risk is a concept more widely used on the context of portfolio, right? And when you're invested in a portfolio, what you get from value at risk is what is the maximum I could lose in a short period of time if everything that could possibly go wrong goes wrong. So that is a little bit of a stress testing of your portfolio to see what's the worst thing that could happen if everything goes wrong. That is, again, something that is useful from the perspective of a portfolio manager, not so much when you're analyzing an individual firm. Not so much when you're analyzing an individual firm. A final note on earnings manipulation, some empirical research about that. You usually can infer that there's some sort of earnings manipulation going on when there's huge variations in some of the 8 items listed in slide 25. So when there was a big change in days in receivables from last year to this year, so what changed so much? These things tend to be set in contracts, or there must be some sort of industry standard where everyone's paying roughly during the same period of time. So large change of that is something I would be suspicious about. Also with the gross margin, big changes in gross margin, depreciation, things that you can manipulate with accounting rules and policies. I would definitely look into those. Yeah, just a list of potential new big risks that we discussed in the past. This is not to finish on a negative note, but just to be aware of other potential risks companies could be facing, mainly on the side we mentioned earlier on potential lawsuits, or lawsuits that the company has to settle, and leaving some funds out of the pocket of credit holders and shareholders. One last thing to do today is our final quiz. So I will share with you the questions to this quiz, and then you're going to be free to go. That's very good. Can we see that? Yeah. The winner will have to follow me because I need to go online sometimes. You have to wear double. Okay. 2 seconds. Here we go. Oh, that's long. We're going to cut it in 30, so 5 seconds. Oh, everyone answered already. One more answer. Yep. Pretty tempting to go with all the above. All of the above. All right. Yeah, different levels, but they all measure that. It's only 7. This is like 2 seconds difference in answering, so you better be quick. We're all in. Really? All right. Last question. Who won? Hey! Well, excited about walking to Woolies? All right, so that was all for today. I will see you next Friday. Good luck with your presentations this week and next week. So next week, what we will do is we're basically going to do an exam review and see what the exam looks like and go through a revision of all the topics. So I'll see you next Friday. Thank you. So you haven't seen the 5 p.m. today? I would send those guys an email. And then also like usually at 5 p.m. you can do it by 7 o'clock. Yeah.